All right, welcome to another Mike Reads Reviews. We're going to go a little bit off topic here. We've been on a lot of economics and policy and American history. Well, I decided to do a little bit of fictional reading for fun. And like I said, I promised, I did complete the Han Solo trilogy. It starts with, this is by A.C. Crispin. It starts with the Paradise Snare, which we did a review on. I'll link to that review in the description. The second book in the trilogy is The Hutt Gambit, and the third book, which I just finished this afternoon, is Rebel Dawn, all by A.C. Crispin. So I already did a review on the Paradise Snare. I would say that the Paradise Snare is probably the closest thing to a standalone book, so I'll just say that the other two books really are not standalone books. They're really dependent on the Paradise Snare, and there's a lot of content in The Hutt Gambit and Rebel Dawn especially that would make no sense if you didn't read the Paradise Snare. So it is absolutely imperative if you're going to start the trilogy that you do start at page 1 in the Paradise Snare and finish the entire trilogy. Otherwise, like I said, Rebel Dawn and the Hutt Gambit are going to make no sense. So I'll say, generally speaking, since this is a review of the trilogy as a whole and as it finishes the Paradise Snare, I really enjoyed this read. I'm not much of a fictional reader, of a fiction reader. I mostly read nonfiction. That's where I get my entertainment from. But in this case, I love this trilogy. I think A.C. Crispin did a marvelous job explaining. I'll try not to do this. I'll try not to spoil these two books as much as I can, The Hutt Gambit and Rebel Dawn. But she does such a good job of explaining Solo's bitter and jaded approach to really everything, and especially women. There's some stuff in there about the Kessel Run. It's obligatory. She does explain how Han gets the hold of the Millennium Falcon, and she does explain how Han meets Chewie and how their relationship builds. I think what I'll say is that as much as I loved it, there were some elements of pacing, especially in Hutt Gambit, that were lacking. So in Hutt Gambit, that's when we first get introduced to Chewie. And to be frank, how Han and Chewie get acquainted, how they first meet, is just glossed over in that book. And I think that does a disservice to the development of Chewbacca as a character, but it's only a minor disservice in my opinion. That's probably the best part of this trilogy, is the relationship between Han and Chewie and Han's development as a character through his relationship with Chewbacca. He's in the Paradise Snare. Han is a very much starry-eyed, well, I would say positive thinking fella who, is looking to get into the Imperial Academy as the book finishes. And by the end of the trilogy, he's a totally jaded, totally self-involved, totally self-indulgent smuggler. And who's a rogue at this point. He's gone from, an innocent young man to an outright rogue, a rebel without a cause, if you will. The original trilogy's James Dean. I think that there were also certain elements of how Han obtained the Millennium Falcon. This is what I'm referring to when I talk about pacing. Bria gets reintroduced. She basically gets ignored for the Hutt Gambit, but she does get reintroduced, Han's original love interest, in Rebel Dawn. There's no way for me to describe it without that. It's in the book notes. It's in the back cover notes of Rebel Dawn, so it's not really spoiling anything to say that. And the relationship Han has with her in this book and her character is developed so beautifully. I wish they had spent as much time, I wish A.C. Crispin had spent as much time going over how Han obtained the Millennium Falcon and how the Kessel Run manifested and how Han met Chewie and Han and Lando's relationship, as much as she did with Bria and her development as a character in the third book, Han's development as a character as a third book. I will say though that in generally speaking, there were some characters that seemed like red shirts, from the Star Trek series, throwaway characters. But generally speaking, the main characters, everything they did made sense within the framework of and context of that trilogy. There wasn't anything really that I had a problem with. what's really cool, I think, is that if you read Han's spoken tone and the way he talks in the Paradise Snare, the first book in the trilogy, it changes. It gradually and intuitively evolves throughout the trilogy to Harrison Ford. Han Solo as a character does not sound like Harrison Ford in Paradise Snare, but he sounds so much like original trilogy Harrison Ford in Rebel Dawn, the third book in the trilogy. And actually, I would say he probably sounds more like Indiana Jones from Raiders of the Lost Ark and not the rest of that trilogy. He sounds more like that Harrison Ford, I think, than the Harrison Ford of Star Wars fame. But it was neat to see that she does such a masterful job of evolving him as a character, that his spoken word actually changes. The way he talks changes throughout the written trilogy here. So that's what I'm referring to, and I'm referring to pacing issues. So I think the third book was probably honestly the best of the trilogy, even though it's totally dependent on the other two books. The Paradise Snare being the only one that could honestly stand alone and stand by itself. So I would go so far as to give, since we're closing in on about our 7-minute mark, and I'm trying to keep these things pretty short and to the point. I would, again, let me just, before I give a numerical value, the Kessel Run, Han's introduction to Greedo, Han's entanglements with Jabba that we know about from A New Hope, all happen within the last 10 pages of this book. So I don't think it's spoiling any part of the trilogy to explain that, but the way Han talks about his debts to Jabba in A New Hope, it sounds like they're old debts. It sounds like this is a debt that he incurred, months ago at least, if not years ago, and that these bounty hunters have been on his tail for a long time and not 5 days. In this book's storyline, it's 5 days. And on top of that, in this book, it's 10 pages out of 400 that he runs into these problems. And then the Kessel Run and 12 parsecs things is actually explained quite well, but either Han has to be lying in A New Hope, in which case that part of the story shouldn't be included, or he's not lying, and something like that would be well known. And in his tone, you've never heard of the Falcon, fastest ship in the galaxy? She's the ship that made the Kessel Run in under 12 parsecs. Well, if he's talking like that, either he's lying or it's something that's so well known and it's the truth that everyone knows it, and word wouldn't spread like that in a matter of 5 days. It wouldn't, even in the context of this trilogy, word would not spread like that in 5 days. It would take months for him to gain notoriety for holding that record, at least. And again, it just gets crammed into the last 10 minutes. So the stories themselves are really well done, but as it fits into the original trilogy and as it fits into the epilogue of the final book, it's just rushed. So this is not a perfect trilogy, I'll say that. And the whole Kessel Run thing is, if in the expanded universe and even in the canon, is just such a mess that I can forgive any imperfections in the backstory for that for AC Crispin. But I don't think that any of the characters themselves are mistreated, especially the original trilogy characters, although of the original trilogy there's really only two, technically a handful of others that get mentioned in passing. Obviously Han and Chewie. And, the way they treat Bria, a lot of fans of this book have problems with Bria becoming, how should I say this, too high up in her positions. I don't think so. I think it's clear that her position evolves and that her role evolves. And AC Crispin actually lays this out, I think, quite well and handles it with care instead of just obligatorily making her some sort of, super high-ranking member of her group, we'll say. So I don't spoil this for everyone. And again, like I said, the character evolves. It isn't just arbitrarily at a certain point. So really good character development. As far as the story itself is concerned, there were some pacing issues. It gets better with age. The Hutt Gambit is definitely the worst of the trilogy. I'll go so far as to give the whole trilogy an 8 out of 10 if I'm going to go on a numerical score. And I think in hindsight, I probably gave the Paradise Snare an 8. It's probably a weak 8, strong 7. The Hot Gambit is probably more like a 7. It's possibly as low as a 6. And I'll go so far as to give Rebel Dawn, the longest book in the series by far, which is something I usually am not keen on. I'll give that a 9 out of 10. I gotta say, I was blowing through twice as many pages a night in Rebel Dawn as I was the other 2 books because it was just that enthralling. So that's been my review of A.C. Crispin's The Han Solo trilogy. In short, would I recommend it? Well, let's see if I can do this right. I think I got this right. So in short, would I recommend the trilogy? Absolutely. Pick it up. It's on Amazon. So that's been my review. Until next time, see you later.